Diogo, what up, sir?
How's it going?
Doing well. Thanks for joining us today. So you're the general partner at Haun, the co-founder and executive chairman of Anchorage Digital, and the chairman of Near Foundation. And we're also on the early teams of Docker and Square. So an
You need
insane,
anything else, or do you want anything else?
dude.
I
I
can
What else
tell
you
mean,
you
got? What else you
is
got?
there more? I'm sure there's
there's
more.
always more.
I'm sure.
There's
I
the
think there's
PhD
a
in
PhD
distributed
somewhere in
systems and
there. Yeah.
security. That's right.
There
There's
we
like
go.
all that stuff that doesn't matter.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm interested in kind of the through line between all these experiences. Like, where do your passions and kind of personal mission lie?
Yeah, that's it's an interesting topic. I think one of the things that you can see is I've only worked in one thing my whole career, which is security and distributed systems, if you want to see it this way, from a researcher and PhD perspective, from an operator at Square in a fintech, from an operator building distributed systems and private key management at Docker, to then building the world's safest one password regulated as a bank, which is Anchorage, to now investing in security in distributed systems. So I've only done one thing. It's just different kind of like takes at it.
Interesting. Okay, so I want to get your take on just institutions coming into crypto generally. Obviously, we're in this crazy period of institutional adoption, and you've been kind of at the center of it since 2017. Most of us are just reading these headlines right now. So I'm interested, what is your on the ground perspective here? Have we finally crossed the chasm to institutional adoption?
100%. In fact, I don't think the question is even one that people pose as naturally or as frequently as they used to 3 years ago. And I think not just we've crossed the chasm, but institutions are not working on just one subset of crypto. There's many subsets of crypto in which institutions are just all in. Stablecoins are all in, tokenization, they're all in. Clearly, Bitcoin, they're all in. There's this other portion of Bitcoin, which started with Bitcoin really, but the treasury companies, which is financial engineering, and so the clash of DeFi and TradFi, also they're all in clearly because they can make a lot of money. All of these traditional sponsors are like finding these SPACs and finding these vehicles. So it's just like there's so many dimensions in which we found product market fit and we found institutional product market fit that I don't think it's a question at this point where institutions are coming. The matter is at what speed, at what rate, in which particular verticals of crypto.
Yeah, so you've talked about stable coins as kind of being a Trojan horse to the tokenization of everything. So I'm curious what's core to your excitement of this trend? Like, where does tokenizing everything get us?
Yeah, that's an interesting. The reason why it's a Trojan horse is not really just a Trojan horse as much as we have created the best marketing packaging for tokenization, which was we've tokenized the dollar and then called it a stable coin and released it out to the world. And it was obviously incredibly successful without the appreciation from general folks outside of crypto that there's no difference between a tokenized dollar and a tokenized anything else because it's the same packaging, it's the same APIs, the same system, same settlements. In fact, a lot of the stablecoin routers, companies that are very popular, like BVNK and Bridge, could very easily just turn around and like with small alterations start actually like routing these other things. And of course, from a regulatory perspective, there's differences there are differences there, but from an API and blockchain perspective, these things are actually not that different, which is amazing. Which then, to me, what it means is if stablecoins are incredibly successful and have clear product market fit from a consumer and institutional perspective, and the second or third largest use case for stablecoins is just holding dollars. Now, it doesn't take much reasoning to say, hey, dollar holding is extremely popular and exciting and clear as product market fit. Something that people want to hold even more than dollars? The moment they have dollars, they want to do investments. So they want dollars, but now they want Tesla. They want access to S&P 500, the QQQ, the American market, investment market, which is, by the way, orders of magnitude larger than M1 and M2, right? And so if you think about it that way, the demand for investments in tokenized equities and tokenized private credit and just access to the general American financial market that we have access to is going to be many orders of magnitude larger than just the access to the dollars.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think the idea of sort of tokenizing stocks seemed, I mean, to me, it didn't seem all that exciting. I think these are, at least in my world, easily accessible products that I can get through, half a dozen specific, brokerage accounts or apps, many of whom do a really great job of onboarding people and making it fun to go long, with leverage, et cetera. And so, I mean, can you maybe put a finer point on why you see the news out of the NASDAQ trying to push for tokenized stocks, the fact
But Jess, let me just push back and say, you also would be the first person to say, I'm not excited about tokenized dollars. I have access to dollars. It's called bank account. I have an ATM.
Not true, though. I think that's not true. I think the tokenized dollar to me, and maybe this isn't part of your argument here, is something that can be a far more active, interactive, and useful for me, at least in the various financial products that I already am interested in using. Right, so it is extending the functionality and the magic that say DeFi was able to bring into the table. So
It's the same characteristics. Once you tokenize a dollar, you get global availability. Well, fractionalization doesn't matter for the dollar, but deeply matters for every single asset class. You get programmability, you get instant settlement, you get all of these, 24/7, all of these characteristics that tokenizing the dollar made it so unique. It's just, as a founder, instead of taking many months to get authorization to do some ledger in which I can offer accounts, checking accounts, or a checking like account, so dollar accounts for my clients, I can do it in 15 minutes permissionlessly. That excitement, all of those characteristics that you're excited about, probably about the stablecoin, they all are the same for securities and tokenized equities. And in fact, they have even other characteristics like fractionalization that just inherent in the way that we tokenize things that are beneficial on their own. I mean, how many products do you see out there that the only thing that they do is like fractional, Berkshire Hathaway stock, because you can actually buy one. And so fractional ownership is actually very exciting. I imagine that globally with the same benefits of stablecoins. So I think, the American-centric view had trouble with the stablecoin dollar, and then you see it. And the American-centric view is definitely having trouble with the equity dollar. But I think the most harebrained way to describe this is global access to American markets, period.
Sure, and that wins me over every time, because I definitely do have blinders on living where I get to live, and just a little bit of travel, and you get to see the excitement people have.
But actually, the excitement of DeFi that you've seen a lot is this permissionless composition of dollar and all these financial instruments in many different ways. And we're just going crazy with inventing like new types of financial instruments and ways to hook it up together. But it's the exact same thing now that you have a security. In fact, it's even more exciting because now we have dollars, we have securities, we're going to have product edit. So when you get all of it on chain, and we get tokenized versions of all these things, then the smart contracts that we had before are one order of magnitude more useful, because now they can actually affect gold, they can now affect real estate, now they can affect securities, private credit. So everything that we add on chain increases network effects in the utility of everything else that came before. That's why this is so exciting.
I think probably like the most societally impactful implication of this will actually be getting like private companies to tokenize, or like, open up public asset to private companies much earlier in their life cycle. I think we see, Stripe, SpaceX, these things are just staying private longer and longer, and tokenizing public stocks isn't actually going to change that. So I'm curious what you see the path to, I guess, like what people are calling internet capital markets today emerging.
So the portion of the capital markets that I think actually is, well, there's many things that are exciting. The one that I've been spending a lot of time on is, can internet capital markets, specifically on-chain IPOs, resolve the bottleneck that we've had with traditional IPOs? Traditional IPOs are not happening. Now they've started happening again. But the bar revenue-wise that you need to be to really go IPO and have one of these large sponsors go through you, and large investment banks to actually be excited to go IPO with you, is around $500 million mark. And there's many, many, many tens of thousands of companies that are over $100 million, but under $500 million that would be easily IPOable, even $50 million, that they just can't get to those thresholds. So can we as crypto actually create a solution for this problem? And I think the answer is yes. And that's one part of the capital markets that I'm really excited about, because it's really about all these companies are getting private longer. In fact, AI made it even worse. The rounds that are happening for OpenAI and for Anthropic are absolutely ridiculous. It makes no sense that there's hundreds of millions of dollars of private value being coalesced into these companies. We all were like crazy about Stripe's 60 billion. Now imagine a company that is 200 or 300. So this clearly needs to be solved. And I do think that we have all the utility and techniques. And you saw Superstate announcing opening bell. So they've tokenized Galaxy stock that is already, it's a superposition. So it trades on the public markets and also trades on DeFi. But I think the next step is, can we actually create a path for companies to start by doing on-chain IPOs and then promoting themselves to actually the general capital markets? It's not about replacing them. It's about creating a path that is easier, sort of like, a stage thing. Like you first are 2 years as a on-chain IPO only, while you're collecting trust, while you're actually getting the maturity to the business that you need, and then you kind of like promote it to the actual general capital markets. I think that actually is one of the most exciting portions of the internet capital markets.
Interesting. So replacing we have this thing called the TSX Venture Exchange, which is where you go if you want to just gamble on resource stocks in Canada, and I think, but the promise was sort of like creating earlier access to capital that then could be promoted to the TSX itself. I'm curious if you sort of break down that category, because it's fascinating to me. Like, what are the pieces that we need to go get right to make that happen? It feels like regulation is a big component of it, but I'm also imagining that there's a lot of entrenched interest here already that might not be the most optimistic about rolling this stuff out unless they get their hands in
Well,
it.
yeah. So the regulation obviously would be the first one, is how can we do it? Once we acknowledge that we're about to do is we're putting a security on chain, then all of a sudden we're not playing these games of like, this has utility, it's a utility token, or this is a commodity or whatever. We're not playing any of those games. We're saying this is security, and thus it needs to meet security laws. So two things immediately. Let's meet the rule of the law as it stands, and let's make sure we influence the SEC in the United States and Atkins around, creating either new rules or clarifying current rules for this world. And so both of these paths are being pursued simultaneously, with a lot of success. On the latter path, we'll see how that goes. There's a lot of good indications coming from the SEC that they believe tokenization is big, and that they're going to create these abilities for these companies to kind of like have these sandboxes to try out things, but also have clear regulation on how these things actually work. But for the first one, I think the exciting part is that we finally actually have all the regulated entities that you could ever want in crypto. You have regulated federal banks like Anchorage. You have, Superstate has an ETS. You have all these broker dealers. So we actually have the capability of issuing, custodying, doing ledgering for this. So the same way that the opening bell has the tokenized stock that is Galaxy is now at DTCC, there's an actual ATS that is a crypto ATS called Superstate that actually has the registration of who owns what, even when it's issued on chain. So that was one of the biggest pieces that we were missing. It's kind of like this linkage just saying, no, this is security. And then you have all the rights of security, whether you buy it on the DeFi side or whether you buy it on the traditional finance side. So that is solved. That was the biggest piece. Now, there's lots of reasons why these things on DeFi are not, infinitely composable, and they have restrictions, and there's some white lists, and there's still some friction that will be solved. 100% will be solved. It's just taking a little bit longer because, again, these things are security, so we can't just like go willy-nilly and do it. But that is already there. And so I think the biggest unlock piece is there. In terms of on-chain IPOs, the next big things actually are kind of sort of pedestrian, but just banks charge so much money for companies to go IPO in ways that they shouldn't. The ATSs charge millions of dollars just to kind of like have the record of these stocks and who owns what and do distribution. And guess what? We have technology and we have blockchains, and we can do this so much easier. So we could actually just do it for free as a loss leader, and then just have the other portion. The things that we can't skirt are there needs to be transparency and rigor on the company's reporting of their revenue. And blockchain helps to certain extents. If you are an on-chain first company, say a staking provider, then that's already clear and it's public and it's reportable by the second. And so that's kind of exciting because a lot of those things could be automatable. But if you're just a traditional run-of-the-mill SaaS and it's private books, you have to have the maturity. You have to have 2 years of financial audits. You have to have some amount of like compliance to make sure that these things are actually on a quarterly basis. They're correct, because you cannot afford to have these errors happen. And so this is actually the final part, is like, how much can we help automate? But again, there's this other piece of technology happening on the side, which is artificial intelligence and automation and et cetera. There's actually lowering the bars for those things. Filing papers with the SEC is extremely easy. Doing a lot of this reconciliation is now extremely easy. If you're blockchain first, then maybe your ledger is already formatted in a way that is extremely easy for you to reconcile. So on and on and on. Maybe you can actually like reduce the cost, the real operational cost of actually getting you ready to go IPO. That's also pretty exciting because it's a confluence of a lot of technologies that are coming together to maybe make this right for the first time. So we have the regulation. We are looking at lowering the costs and then finding ways to automate the portions that have required lots of time on auditing.
Yeah, very interesting. I think maybe the last question before we're gonna have to let you go. I'm curious what your thoughts are on tempo. Like, is it obviously a good thing for crypto that Stripe's building a blockchain, or is the kind of permissioned consortium nature of it directly challenging the, I guess, disruptive potential of the industry and just reconsolidating power?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of takes here. My take is that I'm actually a distributed systems maximalist. So the way that I look at this is the more blockchains, the better. Doesn't really matter where on the spectrum of like trade-offs you are. If you want to
Right.
go fully centralized, that's great. If you want to go fully centralized proof of work, that's great. For me, it's all fantastic. And the exploration itself is really good. I think there's two things that are interesting about Tempo. One of them is that there is a portion of this which it could actually, the thought occurred to me where it might be that for companies like Stripe that have thousands of APIs and such complexity in the ecosystem, blockchains might actually be the way to expose an ecosystem of APIs where you have smart contracts that call the native APIs of API for payments, for bank account transactions, and just to make use of the actual underlying traditional centralized APIs that have already built, but with some ability for developers to work on your ecosystem and build cool applications in your ecosystem. So I can't unsee that. There's some amount of this that is kind of like, oh, maybe everybody should have an ecosystem. Everybody that is big enough, financial technology is big enough that has these useful APIs for people to use. Maybe there's a scope for which this actually makes sense and it's the right way to build an ecosystem on top of you. That's one. Number two, I think there's some amount of I think it makes sense for you to try to verticalize and say, no, there's different requirements for these payment blockchains than generalized blockchains like Solana. I do think that Solana can also build a lot of those. I mean, ISO standardization for payments and compliance, obviously that's something we can build. So hiding behind that as the reason why you're doing your layer one, I think it's not, a great argument. But again, let the 1,000 flowers bloom. The more competition, the better.
Diego, appreciate you hopping on with us. I think
course.
you spoke fast enough to get probably 1.5x the amount of content into this as well, but obviously
Let's
still don't
go.
have enough time to go deeply. I'd love to have you back on at some point and we can dive into this continued institutional growth trend. Thanks, man.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers.
Peace, dude.
Bye.